He walked into the jewelry boutique to buy an engagement ring for a woman he didn't love. He never expected to see the face of the wife he thought had betrayed his family 4 years ago. He definitely never expected the little girl trailing behind her. The heavy glass door clicked shut as Kim Min-jae stepped inside, and the scent of expensive velvet and chilled air conditioning hit him immediately. He paused, one hand still gripping the cold silver handle, his other gloved hand hanging at his side. Outside, his security detail remained like stone pillars beside the armored black sedan, their earpieces glinting in the sun. In his years of commanding both a tech empire and the city's most feared underworld syndicate, Min-jae had never personally shopped for a token of affection. Diamonds were usually delivered to his office in velvet boxes, pre-selected by assistants. But today, a strange, gnawing impulse, something he couldn't name, had driven him to this specific, quiet street. The boutique was intimate, far too quiet for a man who breathed the chaos of boardrooms and back-alley deals. The glass cases were lit with a soft, amber glow, displaying gems that cost more than a common man's life. And then he saw her. She was leaning over a display case, her back to him, adjusting a tray of pearls. Her hair was swept up in a natural, elegant updo he didn't recognize. Her skin, rich and radiant, glowed under the focused spotlights. She hadn't noticed him yet. She was focused on the delicate alignment of the jewelry, humming a tune that made the dragon tattoo on Min-jae's neck feel like it was burning. Min-jae's breath hitched. For years. It had been 4 years since his father had presented the evidence of her treason, 4 years since she had vanished into the night to avoid the chairman's wrath. He took a single step forward, his polished boots silent on the plush carpet. Just as she began to turn, a small, high-pitched laugh echoed from the back office. A toddler, no more than 3 years old, burst into the showroom, her curly hair bouncing as she ran. The child skidded to a stop and looked up, and Min-jae felt the world tilt on its axis. The girl was looking at him with his own piercing, calculating eyes. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind Kim Min-jae, sealing out the humid roar of the city and replacing it with the sterile, pressurized silence of the boutique. The air inside tasted of filtered oxygen and expensive floor wax, a scent he usually found comforting in its predictability. Today, however, it felt stifling. He adjusted the cuff of his dark tailored coat, the silk lining sliding smoothly against his skin, yet he felt a strange, phantom weight pressing against his chest. Behind him, the blurred silhouettes of his security detail stood like monoliths on the other side of the glass, their presence a silent testament to the dangerous world he inhabited. Min-jae was a man who moved through life with the precision of a master-crafted timepiece, yet as he took his first step onto the plush, cream-colored carpet, his rhythm faltered. He was here for a transaction. A ring. A band of platinum and ice to bind a merger between two of the most powerful families in the underworld. It was a cold necessity, a contract written in diamonds. He expected a fawning manager, a tray of stones, and a quick departure back to the armored safety of his sedan. He did not expect the ghost. She was standing at the far end of the long glass counter, her back to him as she meticulously polished a display case. The simple burgundy uniform she wore was a stark contrast to the hand-sewn gowns he remembered her in, yet the curve of her shoulders and the way she held herself, with a quiet, unyielding grace, hit him with the force of a physical blow. The light from the overhead chandeliers caught the natural curls of her updo, and for a moment, the blood in Min-jae's veins turned to liquid nitrogen. "I'll be with you in just a moment," she said, her voice soft and professional, not yet looking up. The sound of her voice bridged a 4-year gap in a single heartbeat. It was a voice he had buried under mountains of corporate filings and the dark, violent business of the syndicate. It was the voice of the woman he had been told was a traitor. When she finally turned, the small spray bottle in her hand slipped, clattering against the glass. Her wide, amber eyes locked onto his, and the professional mask she wore shattered instantly. Her lips parted, a sharp intake of breath echoing in the quiet room, and her face went several shades paler. She looked smaller than he remembered, more vulnerable in the humble setting of the shop, yet her gaze held a frantic, protective fire that he couldn't look away from. Min-jae's hand tightened on the handle of his cane, his knuckles turning white. The calculations of the merger, the wedding, and the legacy he had fought to protect suddenly felt like ash in his mouth. Amara Thompson was supposed to be a memory, a stain on his past that his father had scrubbed away for the sake of the Kim bloodline. Yet here she was, living a quiet, terrestrial life in the heart of the city he thought he owned. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating, filled with the unspoken questions of 4 lost years and the terrifying realization that everything he believed about his world was a lie. The standoff in the boutique felt like a thin sheet of glass under extreme pressure, ready to shatter at the slightest breath. Min-jae stood frozen, his calculating gaze fixed on Amara, whose hands were trembling so violently she had to grip the edge of the mahogany counter to remain upright. The air between them was thick with the suffocating weight of 4 years of silence, a vacuum that swallowed the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant thrum of the street outside. He was waiting for her to speak, for her to plead, or perhaps for her to run, but before a single word could be exchanged, the heavy velvet curtain at the back of the shop fluttered. A small, rhythmic thudding of footsteps on the carpet broke the silence. "Mama, look what I drew." A toddler, no more than 3 years old, burst into the showroom with the unbridled energy of a sunburst. She was clad in a soft green top, her curly hair bouncing with every step as she held up a crinkled piece of paper. The child skidded to a stop just a few feet away from Min-jae's polished boots. The world didn't just stop for Min-jae, it inverted. He looked down, and the Ice King mask he had worn since birth, the one forged in the cold boardrooms of Seoul and the dark alleys of the syndicate, began to spiderweb with deep, irreparable cracks. The little girl, Zara, tilted her head back to look at the tall, imposing stranger. She didn't shrink away in fear like most adults did. Instead, she squinted, her small face mirroring a look of intense, quiet calculation that Min-jae saw every morning in his own vanity mirror. But it was more than just the expression. As she raised her hand to point at his shiny watch, the sleeve of her top slipped back, revealing a distinct, crescent-shaped birthmark on the inside of her wrist. It was the mark of the Kim, a genetic anomaly that had appeared on the firstborn of every generation for a century. It was on his own wrist, hidden beneath the cuff of his charcoal coat. "Zara, honey, come here," Amara gasped, her voice a ragged plea. She scrambled around the counter, scooping the child into her arms and pulling her back into a protective embrace. She held the girl as if she were a shield, her eyes starting toward the glass door where Min-jae's security detail hovered like dark omens. Min-jae felt a roar in his ears, a deafening cacophony of realization. This child wasn't just a coincidence. She was his blood, his legacy, and his heart beating outside of his chest. He looked at the girl's eyes, sharp, dark, and piercingly intelligent, and saw his own reflection staring back at him with a purity he had long ago traded for power. The diamond ring he had come to buy, the political marriage he had agreed to, and the empire his father had built on lies all dissolved into insignificance. "How long?" he whispered, his voice cracking, a sound so foreign to him that it felt like it belonged to another man. He took a step forward, his hand instinctively reaching out toward the child, but Amara flinched, pulling Zara tighter. The curious, slightly concerned look on the little girl's face as she watched the Ice King crumble was the most devastating thing he had ever witnessed. In that velvet-lined room, surrounded by cold stones and gold, Kim Min-jae finally realized that the only treasure worth owning had been stolen from him years ago. The silence of the boutique was no longer peaceful. It was a pressurized chamber, vibrating with the force of the truth that was about to explode. Min-jae stood amidst the glittering displays of diamonds and gold, yet he felt as though he were standing in the middle of a graveyard. He watched Amara, her body still acting as a frantic barricade between him and the little girl who possessed his very soul. Zara, sensing the shift in the air, burrowed her face into her mother's shoulder, her small hands clutching the burgundy fabric of the uniform with a strength that broke Minjae's heart. "How long?" Minjae repeated, his voice barely a rasp. He didn't recognize himself. The man who could command an army of hackers and enforcers with a single nod was now struggling to draw breath. "Why did you run, Amara?" "I searched for you. I was told you were the one who betrayed us. I was told you took the syndicate's secrets to the highest bidder and fled." Amara let out a hollow, jagged laugh that sounded like glass grinding against stone. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time, he saw the depth of the trauma etched into the corners of her eyes. "You searched for me? Or did you send your father's cleanup crew to finish what you started?" She tightened her grip on Zara, her knuckles white. "I didn't run because I was guilty, Minjae. I ran because the chairman sat me in the back of a black sedan and showed me a file. He showed me photos of your execution orders. He told me that you were the one who signed them. He said that my presence was a stain on the Kim legacy, and if I didn't disappear, if I didn't erase myself and the life I had in me, that neither of us would survive the night." Minjae felt the floor beneath his polished boots turn to liquid. The betrayal was so vast, so systemic, that it defied comprehension. He thought of his father, the chairman, whose smile was as cold as a surgical blade. He remembered the night 4 years ago when the chairman had sat him down, poured him a glass of aged whiskey, and calmly explained that Amara had been a spy all along. "He told me you wanted me dead," Amara whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of 4 years of terror. "He said you were the one who found the evidence of my treason. I spent every night for the first year looking over my shoulder, waiting for one of your men to step out of the shadows. I changed my name, I moved 3 times, and I worked under the table just to keep her safe. I didn't think you'd ever find us. I didn't think you'd even want to." The realization hit Minjae with the force of a physical assault. His father hadn't just removed a woman he deemed unfit for the family. He had weaponized Minjae's own grief and rage to turn him into a colder, more obedient weapon. Every decision Minjae had made since then, the ruthless expansion of the tech empire, the agreement to a loveless political marriage, had been fueled by the belief that the only person he ever loved had been his greatest enemy. He looked at Zara, who was peering over Amara's shoulder with those sharp, dark eyes, and he felt a cold, terrifying fire ignite in his chest. The Ice King was gone, replaced by a man who finally understood exactly who the monster was. His father hadn't just stolen 4 years of his life. He had tried to murder his grandchild's existence before she was even born. Minjae straightened his shoulders, his calculating gaze shifting toward the glass door where his security detail waited. The war wasn't coming anymore, it was already here. And this time, he wouldn't be fighting for a legacy, he would be fighting to burn it to the ground. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across Wendy Street, a neighborhood that existed in a different universe from the steel and glass towers of the Kim corporate empire. Minjae stood by the window of Amara's modest apartment, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. Outside, the world seemed quiet, but his eyes, trained by years of navigating the treacherous currents of the underworld, saw the true landscape. 2 unmarked black SUVs had already taken their positions at either end of the block. Men in inconspicuous attire, their earpieces the only tell of their lethal profession, moved with practiced ease into the shadows of recessed doorways and alleyways. He had given the order before even leaving the jewelry boutique, a full tactical perimeter, 24-hour surveillance, and an immediate shoot-to-stop authorization for any unauthorized approach. It was a mobilization of his private elite guard, a force usually reserved for high-level syndicate warfare. But as he watched a neighbor walk their dog, oblivious to the war footing of the street, a bitter irony settled in his throat. He wasn't protecting Amara and Zara from rival gangs or corporate spies. He was protecting them from his own blood. He was shielding his daughter from the very man who had taught him how to breathe in the dark, his father, the chairman. They don't like being watched. Amara's voice broke through his thoughts, quiet and weary. She was sitting on the edge of the sofa, Zara finally asleep in the small bedroom down the hall. The apartment was filled with the scents of lavender and old paper, a jarring contrast to the scent of gunpowder and cold rain that usually followed Min-jae. He turned from the window, his dark coat still buttoned, his posture rigid. "It is not a request, Amara. The moment I walked into that shop, the clock started. My father's informants are everywhere. By now, he knows I didn't buy a ring for the marriage he arranged. He knows I found you. And if he knows about Zara." He trailed off, the dragon tattoo on his neck feeling like a brand. He views everything through the lens of legacy. To him, she is either a tool or a threat. I will not let her be either. Amara looked up at him, her eyes searching the hard lines of his face for the man she had once loved. "You've turned our home into a fortress, Min-jae. But what happens when the fortress becomes a cage? You're using his methods to fight him. How does that make you different?" Min-jae didn't have an answer. He looked at his hands that had signed off on cold-blooded takeovers and remained steady in the face of violence. For the first time, the weight of his power felt like lead. He realized that to save the only two people who mattered, he had to become the very monster his father had spent decades grooming him to be, but with a different purpose. He was no longer the heir apparent. He was a guardian at the gate of a world he didn't deserve to enter. As the streetlights flickered to life on Wendy Street, reflecting off the darkened windows of the security detail outside, Min-jae understood the cost of his protection. He had brought the shadows of the Kim family to her doorstep, and he wouldn't rest until he had burned those shadows out of existence, even if he had to burn himself down along with them. The air at the Kim ancestral estate was thin and frigid, tasting of pine needles and the ancient, suffocating weight of tradition. Min-jae strode through the grand foyer, his polished boots striking the marble floor with a cadence that sounded like the cocking of a weapon. He didn't wait for the butler to announce him. He pushed through the heavy oak doors of the chairman's private study, a room where the air was thick with the scent of old leather and the metallic tang of unearned power. His father sat behind a desk carved from a single piece of dark ebony, his posture as impeccable and sharp as a guillotine blade. The older man didn't look up from the calligraphy he was practicing. His hand remained steady, the brush moving with a grace that masked a lifetime of cruelty. "You missed the tasting for the engagement gala," Min-jae, the chairman said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that used to make Min-jae's blood run cold. The pharmaceutical board was disappointed. They expect a groom who understands the value of punctuality. "The engagement is over," Min-jae replied, his voice a flat, dangerous vibration. He stood in the center of the room, refusing to take the seat offered by the shadows. "And the lies are over, too. I found Amara. I know about the execution orders. I know about the child." The chairman's brush flickered, a single drop of black ink marring the pristine rice paper, the only sign of his agitation. He slowly set the brush aside and looked up, his eyes two chips of frozen flint. "A child," he repeated, a thin, ghost-like smile touching his lips. "You mean the bastard girl born of a traitor? You should be thanking me, Min-jae. I gave you the chance to lead this empire without the anchor of a woman who had no place in our world. I gave you a clean slate. You tried to murder my daughter before she took her first breath," Min-jae growled, stepping into the light. The dragon tattoo on his neck seemed to pulse with the heat of his rising fury. "You used my grief to turn me into your puppet. But that ends today. I am moving them to a secure location. If any of your men so much as breathe the air on their street, I will dismantle every shell company you've spent 40 years building." The chairman stood up, his presence expanding to fill the room like a gathering storm. He didn't look like an old man. He looked like a force of nature that had forgotten how to feel mercy. He walked around the desk, stopping mere inches from his son. "You think you can protect her? You think a few elite guards can stop the reach of the Kim family? You are a fool, Min-jae. That girl is a Kim. She carries the mark. She is not a person. She is an asset of this syndicate. If you will not bring her here to be raised in the traditions of our house, then I will take her by force. I will have her fetched like a stray pup, and you will watch from the sidelines as I mold her into something far more obedient than you have become. The threat hung in the air, cold and jagged. Min-jae felt the Ice King within him finally shatter, replaced by a volcanic, protective rage he had never known. He realized then that there was no room for negotiation or filial piety. To save Zara, he had to destroy the man who had created him. If you touch her, Min-jae whispered, his voice vibrating with a lethal promise, I won't just take your company. I will erase your name from history. Try me, father. See which one of us is the real monster. He turned on his heel and walked out, the sound of the closing door echoing like a gunshot through the silent halls of the estate. The war had officially moved from the shadows into the light. The Grand Cathedral was a monument to cold, ivory-white perfection, a cathedral of wealth where the air smelled of lilies and the stifling weight of expectation. Min-jae stood in the mahogany-paneled vestry, staring at his reflection in a full-length mirror. He was dressed in a tuxedo that cost more than the jewelry shop where he had found his heart again, the black silk of his lapels as dark as the secrets he had kept for 4 years. Outside the doors, 1,000 of the city's most influential figures, ministers, tech rivals, and the pharmaceutical elite, waited for a union that was supposed to cement a dynasty. His father, the chairman, stood by the window, his back turned, watching the arrival of the motorcades. The silence between them was a sharpened blade, vibrating with the unspoken threats of their previous encounter. It's time, Min-jae, the chairman said, not turning around. The cameras are live. The markets are already reacting to the merger. Do not let your recent delusions cloud the path I have laid for you. Min-jae didn't answer. He felt the weight of his phone in his pocket, a short video clip Amara had sent him an hour ago, Zara, laughing as she tried to catch a bubble in their living room. That sound was the only thing that felt real in this hollow palace of stone. He adjusted his cuffs, his movements deliberate and calm. The Ice King was back, but he was no longer cold for the sake of the Kim legacy. He was cold for the sake of a revolution. As the heavy organ pipes began to roar, vibrating through the floorboards, the doors to the sanctuary swung open. Min-jae walked down the aisle, his face a mask of impenetrable marble. His fiancée, a woman whose name he barely spoke in private, waited at the altar, a vision of lace and artificial smiles. But as Min-jae reached the steps, he didn't turn to face her. Instead, he looked directly at the front row, where his father sat with a look of smug triumph. Min-jae turned toward the crowd, his voice amplified by the microphone at the altar, cutting through the music like a thunderclap. This wedding is over, he stated, the words simple and devastating. A collective gasp rippled through the pews, followed by a deafening, panicked silence. He looked at his fiancée, seeing the shock turn to fury, but he felt no guilt. This merger was built on a foundation of lies and the blood of those I was told to abandon. I will not stand here and vow my life to a future designed by a man who attempted to erase my own daughter. He pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped a command. Simultaneously, every screen in the cathedral and every news outlet streaming the wedding of the century flashed with a high-resolution image of a DNA report and a photo of Zara. I have an heir, Min-jae continued, his voice echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings. And from this moment forward, I am reclaiming my life. If the Kim legacy requires me to be a monster, then I will be the monster that burns it down. He walked off the altar, his boots clicking rhythmically against the stone, moving past his father, whose face had turned a sickly, ashen gray. Min-jae didn't look back. He walked through the towering doors, out into the bright, chaotic sunlight of the real world, leaving behind the scandal of a lifetime. He climbed into his private sedan, the one not monitored by his father's men, and gave the driver a single address, Wendy Street. The vows he had broken were nothing compared to the promise he had just kept. The sanctuary of Min-jae's private command center was a cavern of cool blue light and the rhythmic hum of high-end servers, a stark contrast to the blinding, holy white of the cathedral he had just abandoned. He sat at the center of the console, his tuxedo jacket discarded on the floor, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled up to reveal the dragon tattoo that seemed to writhe in the flickering glow of a dozen monitors. Around him, 3 of the syndicate's most elite digital operatives, ghosts who didn't exist in any government database, worked in a feverish, clicking silence. They weren't looking for corporate rivals or market trends tonight. They were hunting a ghost through a labyrinth of offshore accounts and encrypted ledgers. "I don't care about the encryption levels," Min-jae said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that carried more weight than a shout. "My father believes he is the architect of this world because he owns the banks. Remind him that I own the wires they run on. Find the origin of the evidence that destroyed my wife's life." For 4 years, Min-jae had lived with a hollow ache, believing Amara had sold him out for a payday. He had viewed the digital trail of her betrayal as absolute truth because it was written in the language he trusted most, data. But as the lead hacker bypassed a final firewall in a Cayman Islands shell company, a new set of numbers began to cascade down the screen in a waterfall of crimson text. It wasn't a paper trail of a leak, it was a paper trail of blood. The operative paused, his fingers hovering over the mechanical keyboard. "Sir, we found it. But it wasn't a payout from a competitor. The funds used to create the fake leak account in Ms. Thompson's name didn't come from outside. They were routed through a subsidiary of the Kim Group 4 days before she disappeared." Min-jae leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the timestamps. There it was, a series of fractional transfers designed to look like a messy, desperate betrayal. But the digital fingerprint at the root of the transaction wasn't Amara's. It was an administrative override code that belonged to only one person in the entire organization, the chairman. His father hadn't just framed her. He had used the company's own security budget to buy the fabricated evidence from a dark web forgery ring. He had paid to destroy his son's happiness with the very money Min-jae had worked to earn. A second monitor flickered to life, displaying a recovered, deleted memo. It was a wire transfer to a private security firm, the cleanup crew, with a memo line that made the air in the room turn to ice. Elimination of liability. The date was the day after Zara's birth had been confirmed by the chairman's spies. The Ice King didn't just crack this time. He shattered into 1,000 jagged blades. Min-jae stared at the screen, the cold realization of his father's depravity sinking into his marrow. The chairman hadn't just been protecting a legacy. He had been playing a god, deciding who deserved to breathe based on the purity of a bloodline. Min-jae stood up, the chair scraping harshly against the floor. He didn't need to see anymore. He had the weapon he needed to dismantle the man who had made him. "Dump everything," Min-jae ordered, his voice echoing with a lethal finality. "Every transfer, every memo, every forged signature. Upload it to the board's private server and the federal investigators simultaneously. If he wants to treat our family like a business transaction, I'm going to make sure he's bankrupt by morning." He turned toward the door, his eyes reflecting the cold, digital fire of the screens. The paper trail ended here, but the retribution was only just beginning. The glass-walled boardroom of the Kim Group sat atop the city like a crown of ice, overlooking a kingdom that was currently in the midst of a digital meltdown. Inside, the air was thick with the suffocating scent of panic and expensive cologne. The board of directors, men who had grown rich and powerful in the shadow of Chairman Kim's ruthlessness, sat in stunned silence, their eyes glued to the tablets in front of them. The evidence Min-jae had unleashed was not a mere scandal, it was an autopsy of the chairman's moral rot. Every forged signature, every wire transfer to the cleanup crew, and every encrypted memo regarding the elimination of liability was laid bare in high-definition clarity. The heavy double doors at the end of the room swung open with a bang that sounded like a gavel. Min-jae walked in, his presence so commanding that several directors instinctively stood up. He had traded his wedding tuxedo for a suit of obsidian black, his tie knotted with surgical precision. He didn't take his usual seat at the side of the table. Instead, he walked directly to the head of the boardroom, where his father sat. The chairman looked older than he had that morning, his face a sallow mask of suppressed rage. He didn't look at the screens. He didn't look at the trembling directors. He kept his eyes fixed on his son, his fingers tapping a rhythmic, impatient beat on the mahogany table. "You've made a mess," Min-jae, the older man said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that still carried a hint of the old terror. "You've tanked the stock. You've invited the feds into our house. All for a woman and a child who will be forgotten in a week." "The only thing being forgotten today, father, is your name," Min-jae replied, his voice echoing with a cold, absolute finality. He leaned over the table, his hands planted firmly on the wood, staring directly into the abyss of his father's eyes. "The board has already seen the trail. The authorities have the warrants. But I'm giving you one choice, the only mercy you will ever receive from me. Sign the resignation and the transfer of the family trust to a blind fund for Zara. If you do, I'll let your lawyers fight the criminal charges from a private villa instead of a state cell. If you don't, I'll release the second folder, the one containing the syndicate's offshore hit list." The silence that followed was absolute. The directors held their breath, watching the two titans of the Kim dynasty face off. The chairman's eyes darted to the tablets, then back to Min-jae. He saw the Ice King he had created, but for the first time, he realized he didn't own the frost. Min-jae wasn't acting out of a desire for power. He was acting with the desperate, lethal precision of a father protecting his cub. With a hand that finally, visibly shook, the chairman reached for the silver fountain pen. The scratch of the nib against the legal parchment was the only sound in the room, the sound of an empire changing hands. As the chairman finished his signature, Min-jae reached down and snatched the document away. He didn't look back as his father was escorted out by security detail that now answered only to the son. The coup was silent, bloodless in the physical sense, but it had severed the head of a monster. Min-jae turned to the board, his eyes like polished steel. "The Kim Group is under new management," he stated. "And the first order of business is to make sure the world knows that we no longer deal in shadows." The morning sun filtered through the canopy of the public park, casting dappled patterns of light across the grass, a world of vibrant greens and soft breezes that felt 1,000 miles away from the cold, obsidian heights of the Kim Group. Min-jae stood near the edge of the playground, leaning against the rough bark of an oak tree, his dark-tailored coat unbuttoned and swaying slightly in the wind. For the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at a watch or a stock ticker. He wasn't calculating a merger or anticipating a threat. He was simply watching. Across the wood chips, Zara was climbing the steps of a bright yellow slide with the focused determination of a seasoned mountaineer. Amara stood at the bottom, her hands held out in a gesture of constant, quiet protection, her face glowing with a peace he hadn't seen since the days before the shadows had torn them apart. The Ice King was nowhere to be found. In his place was a man who felt the terrifying, beautiful weight of a heartbeat that didn't belong to him. He watched as Zara reached the top, her small hands gripping the sides of the slide. She took a moment to look around the park, her eyes wide and curious, before her gaze landed on him. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. There was no board of directors, no disgraced chairman, no legacy of violence. There was only a father and a daughter. Zara didn't look at him with the fear the world usually reserved for the head of the Kim syndicate. She looked at him with a budding, instinctive recognition that made the dragon tattoo on his neck feel like a relic of a past life. She pushed off, sliding down with a squeal of pure, unadulterated joy. Amara caught her at the bottom, the two of them collapsing into a fit of giggles. Minjae felt a lump form in his throat, a physical manifestation of a decade's worth of suppressed emotion. He realized then that power wasn't found in the command of a billion-dollar empire or the fear in a rival's eyes. It was found here, in the ability to ensure that this laughter continued, undisturbed by the ghosts of his family's sins. With a deep, steadying breath, Minjae stepped out from the shadow of the oak tree. His polished boots, usually reserved for the marble floors of power, crunched softly on the wood chips. Amara looked up, her expression softening into a tentative, hopeful smile as she saw him approach. He didn't stop at the edge of the playground this time. He walked right into the center of their world. "Can I try?" he asked, his voice low and devoid of its usual clinical edge. Zara looked at him, then at the slide, and then back at him. She reached out a small, sticky hand and patted his knee. "You're too big," she decided with the blunt honesty of a child. Minjae laughed, a genuine, chest-deep sound that felt like the first real breath he'd taken in years. He knelt in the wood chips, ignoring the ruin of his expensive trousers, and looked Zara in the eye. "Maybe you're right, but I can help you up the ladder." As he stood and took his daughter's hand, leading her back toward the steps, he felt the final remnants of the Kim legacy fall away. He wasn't a boss, a billionaire, or an heir. He was a man starting over, one playground slide at a time. The first steps of his new legacy weren't written in ink or blood, but in the sand of a neighborhood park, under the watchful, loving eyes of the woman he had finally brought home. The story of Minjae, Amara, and Zara serves as a powerful testament to the idea that true legacy is not measured by the empire one builds, but by the love one has the courage to protect. For years, Minjae lived under the cold delusion that power, status, and family honor were the ultimate goals of a successful life. He allowed himself to be molded into a man of ice, believing that vulnerability was a weakness and that loyalty meant blind obedience to a corrupt authority. However, his encounter in the jewelry shop reveals a profound truth. A life built on the suffering of others and the sacrifice of one's heart is not a kingdom, it is a prison. The moral center of this story lies in the courage to choose. Minjae had to realize that being a leader meant nothing if he wasn't brave enough to lead his own life. By dismantling his father's dark legacy, he proves that it is never too late to break a cycle of trauma and lies. He teaches us that while we cannot change the shadows of our past, we have the absolute power to decide who we are in the light of the present. Ultimately, the story reminds us that the most significant mergers aren't corporate, they are the quiet, everyday moments of reconnection. Success isn't found in a boardroom or a billion-dollar contract. It is found in the laughter of a child at a playground and the quiet forgiveness of a partner. To truly win at life is to realize that the only treasures worth guarding are the ones that can't be bought, sold, or stolen, the ones that look back at us with eyes full of hope.